June 7, 1944. The gray North Sea presses at the hulls of an armada that disappears into mist on every horizon. On the deck of HMS Centaur, spray stings faces and rivulets run through the seams of great steel plates. Men in oilskins hunched against the wind, bracing themselves as the transport rolls in slow, grinding rhythm. Below decks, in a bay now cluttered with pontoons and scaffolding, Royal Engineers pass crates of unfamiliar hardware, concrete caissons stamped with serial numbers, mechanical fenders wrapped in tarpaulin, sections of roadway like sections of bridge laid out like a disassembled town. Everything smells of salt, diesel and hot metal. Commander Edward Ted Mallory of the 17th Royal Engineers stands with his collar turned up and a clipboard in one gloved hand, peering through the haze toward the strip of black sand already seething with men. His hair is dark at the temples, his face scored with weeks of planning and sleepless nights. Around him, petty officers shout terse orders: hoist the block, lash the frame, watch your tag. And the ship answers like an enormous animal taught to obey. Mallory's voice is low, a machine of decision in the middle of the chaos. Keep calm. We move when the tides allow. Every piece to its mark. The thing they carry is called Mulberry on paper, a harmless name concealing a monstrous invention. It is a harbor built to be carried across an ocean. Prefabricated roadways, floating piers, giant concrete cubes called phoenix caissons that will be sunk to form breakwaters, and colossal steel boxes, whale floating roadways and spud pier heads, designed to bob but hold. The idea is obscene in its audacity. Build a port where no port stands. Anchor it off an open shore that the Germans think will never hold anything heavier than a landing craft. Make it work under shelling, surf, and storms. Make it work fast enough to feed an invasion. Far to the east, across the channel and behind sand-scarred hedgerows, German radio rooms crackle with routine bulletins. Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Krauss, a staff officer of coastal artillery, stands in a concrete observation post cut into a cliff near Aramanches. He stares at a horizon he believes he knows. 4 months, German intelligence has catalogued the Allies' strengths, divisions, transport schedules, radio chatter. They have expected the invasion and placed their bets. Block the ports, hold the beaches, choke supply lines. The idea that the enemy could simply float a harbor across the sea seems, at most, the feverish dream of Allied propaganda. Krauss, like many of his peers, has other concerns. Where to position the 88s, how best to interdict the thin columns of armored vehicles they expect to come ashore. He files his report with the confident bureaucratic motions of a man who believes in ordnance, not miracles. Back among the mast hulls, landing craft roll and overlap. British and American tugs spool cable like spools of thread. Men in small boats ferry officers and engineers between the larger ships and the first rudimentary piers already being hacked into the surf. Lieutenant James Calloway, a young American Navy officer assigned to a Mulberry detail, gets his first sight of the concrete caissons being winched from a transport and lowered with the precision of cathedral masons. Each caisson, a hulking rectangular mass of reinforced concrete, looks absurd against the foaming sea. The leviathans are marked with chalk, chain, and 1,000 hands. As one slams and grinds into the water, the sound is a low, grinding thud that seems to reorganize the rhythm of the world. They work like ants with a clear, impossible choreography. A corvette positions a marker buoy, a cable is guided, a caisson is filled with water to sink and found against the seabed, a metal roadway is floated and fastened, a floating pier rocks gently as engineers bolt nose to tail. Each action is a gamble against tides and wind and enemy eyes. Men shout across the spray to coordinate the lifts. A shore party wages a near-constant war against the incoming surf to keep the newly formed ramps from collapsing before the first truck can cross. All around, battles rage by other names. The fight for air superiority, the suppression of coastal batteries, the securing of beach exits. The Mulberry is only a single, audacious front in 1,000 simultaneous fights. Mallory watches a landing craft nose onto a newly assembled stretch of floating roadway. A truck, crusted with mud from some earlier engagement, rumbles forward, climbs, and carries its first load of ammunition and rations across a surface that an hour before had been an open beach. Men who had doubted stand motionless and then clap gloved hands. Calloway grins like a boy who has just seen a toy car become a locomotive. The sea still has its teeth, the harbor is fragile, waves still slap the pontoons with hungry hands. But the math is changing. Concrete, steel, engineering, and will are conjoining into a functioning artery. Up on the cliffs, Oberstleutnant Krauss squints at the horizon and at a map folded so many times its creases are memory. Some reports reach him, strange shapes offshore, machinery being assembled, but the familiar voice of high command is calm, measured. No real port has been reported captured. The Allied penetrations seem localized. He files the odd reports as anomalies. He keeps his 88s oriented toward the beaches. In his mind, supply must cross the beachhead and be vulnerable to interdiction. He trusts his calculations. For now, in the damp dawn and the noise of winches, in the hush of men lining up to pass bolts and heaving together steel, the harbor rises like a promise. Trucks cross. Engineers smile through the spray. A world once imagined on drafting tables is now visible in the pattern of wakes and anchored concrete. The Allies have not merely stormed a beach. They are turning the sea into storage, movement and sustainment, a floating city of war. If the German staff on the cliffs cannot see it yet, the men on the water can feel it. The invasion's lifeline is being woven, plank by plank, into the surging sea. The vision for this miracle of steel and tide began years earlier, in the quiet drafting rooms of Britain's Ministry of Supply, before a single landing craft touched the sand of Normandy. The year was 1942. London was still scarred from the Blitz. Ration lines wound through foggy streets. The drone of distant bombers was a nightly punctuation to survival. Yet in hidden workshops beneath the Thames embankment and along the shipyards of Portsmouth, a group of engineers and officers gathered to design the unthinkable, a man-made harbor that could be assembled in days in enemy waters. It was here that Sir Winston Churchill, in one of his signature flashes of intuition, wrote a simple yet profound directive to his planners. Bring me the means to land and supply our armies where no port exists. Let the sea itself be our harbor. What followed was a convergence of minds that mirrored Britain's peculiar genius, stubborn, inventive, and quietly brilliant. Among them was Brigadier Bruce White, an engineer of modest demeanor but boundless imagination. His team, the Inter-Services Topographical Department, began sketching the impossible. Floating concrete docks the size of buildings, flexible roadways that could survive channel tides, and massive steel pierheads that could rise and fall with the surf yet hold the weight of a loaded tank. Their drawings were crude at first, pencil lines over coffee-stained paper, rough outlines that looked more like toys than tools of war. Even within the War Office, skeptics abounded. A floating port? One admiral reportedly scoffed. Why not a floating city while we're at it? But White and his engineers persisted. They built scale models, ran tests in wave tanks, and even dropped concrete blocks into calm coves to measure how they'd hold under current. What they discovered was astonishing. With the right anchors, ballast, and flexibility, even massive concrete structures could float, and could be linked like beads on a chain to form a seawall. They called these floating blocks Phoenix caissons. Each would weigh thousands of tons, yet would be towed across the English Channel by humble tugboats, to be sunk in precise formation to form a breakwater. The roadway itself would be whale, a stretch of flexible steel and concrete that moved with the waves. Vehicles could drive from ships onto floating piers over the whale and directly onto the beach. It was engineering poetry, as elegant as it was mad. By late 1943, under top-secret orders, the British began constructing the first components along their southern coast. From Dover to Southampton, the sound of hammering and welding filled the air. Shipyards that once built destroyers were now assembling enormous hollow blocks and floating bridges. Entire villages were cordoned off. Curious locals were told simply that new defensive structures were being prepared. Few suspected that the future of the war was being forged just beyond the hedgerows. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American engineers of the U.S. Army Corps were developing their own variants. More modular, more easily assembled, more industrial. The Allies agreed to build two full harbors, one British, codenamed Mulberry B, and one American, Mulberry A. Together, they would be the logistical backbone of Operation Overlord. In late April 1944, only weeks before D-Day, the final prototypes were tested in Scotland's Loch Striven. Officers and engineers stood in raincoats, watching as tugboats dragged concrete sections into place. The sea rolled gray and cold, but the floating harbor held. Trucks drove over it, soldiers marched across it, and cranes unloaded supplies from ships to shore. For a moment, disbelief gave way to awe. A man-made port, rising and falling with the tide, swaying but unbroken. Churchill himself was briefed in private. His reply, dry and understated, was simply, "Very well. Let's see the Hun laugh when this comes ashore." By June the plan was set. As part of the D-Day assault, hundreds of ships would carry not only men and weapons, but an entire harbor in pieces, to be reassembled under fire. It would be the greatest single feat of wartime engineering ever attempted. Back in France, German intelligence remained blind to it all. To them, the idea that the Allies would build a port on open beaches was preposterous. They believed any invasion would hinge on capturing existing harbors, Cherbourg, Le Havre, Calais. Their entire defensive strategy depended on it. And that was precisely the Allies' advantage. The deception campaigns, Operation Fortitude, fake radio chatter, inflatable tanks, phantom divisions, kept the Germans guessing. When D-Day arrived, and the first caissons appeared on the horizon, even experienced Wehrmacht officers mistook them for damaged ships or wreckage. The true nature of Mulberry was a secret too audacious for even their imagination. As the tides turned literally and strategically, the quiet genius of Britain's engineers was about to become visible to the world, and the German High Command would soon learn, to their horror, that the Allies had turned the sea itself into a weapon. The harbor was not a gamble anymore. It was destiny, welded and floating toward the shores of Normandy. June 9, 1944. The storm over the English Channel has softened to a rough, gray churn, but the swells still toss small craft like toys. In the distance, the Normandy coastline, scarred, smoking and alive with activity, rises from the mist. Thousands of landing ships, tankers and tugboats crowd the sea, each carrying a piece of something extraordinary. From the deck of the tug Empire Oak, Lieutenant James Calloway, his uniform soaked in sea spray and diesel, clings to the rail as the first massive Phoenix caisson is towed into position. Its concrete skin gleams wet and pale, blackened in places by soot and barnacles from its journey. The men guiding it look impossibly small beside it, ants commanding a mountain. Steady. Watch the drift. A British engineer yells through a megaphone, his words shredded by the wind. Lines snap taut, cables groan, and the caisson inches forward through the waves like a sleeping beast waking. When it reaches its mark, Calloway signals to flood the ballast tanks. Slowly, the hollow giant begins to sink, bubbles frothing at its corners until the sea swallows it halfway. The surface shudders, then steadies, the first of dozens that will form the breakwater. Out to the horizon, more hulks appear. Ancient ships stripped of weapons, loaded with explosives, destined to be scuttled deliberately. These are the Gooseberry block ships, sacrificed to form an outer wall against the surf. British destroyers escort them like funeral processions, saluting as they settle into the water with muffled booms. Within hours, a jagged line of wrecks stretches across the coastline, taming the waves just enough for the next phase. The ocean is being reshaped by design. By nightfall, the sea glows with work, welders' torches, the white beams of spotlights, and the occasional red flare marking new construction zones. Engineers work in shifts, eating cold rations on floating pontoons, sleeping beside piles of bolts and anchor chains. Seagulls hover over the wrecks, crying in the smoke. The noise never stops. Engines thrum, cranes creak, steel grinds against steel. Each section of the Mulberry must lock perfectly into the next. Floating roadways, whales, stretch outward from the anchored pierheads. Men guide them into place with ropes and winches, shouting across the surf to align the joints. As dawn breaks, a strange sight emerges, the outline of a harbor born from the sea, shimmering under the pale morning light. On shore, infantrymen and supply units, weary from days of fighting inland, turn to watch. "What in God's name are they building?" one sergeant mutters, cigarette hanging from his lip. "A bloody miracle," another replies. By June 14, just 8 days after D-Day, the British Mulberry at Arromanches is operational. The first Liberty ship, the SS Empire Windrush, eases toward the new docks, escorted by tugboats flying the Union Jack. The moment her hull kisses the floating pier, cheers rise from hundreds of throats. Within hours, cranes begin unloading crates, vehicles, and ammunition. Food, medicine, and fuel follow. In that single day, over 1,000 tons of supplies reached the shore, more than had been landed across all beaches combined during the first hours of the invasion. Across the channel, the German command still refuses to believe what they are hearing. In a concrete bunker near St. Lo, Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Krauss scans intercepted radio reports, his brow furrowed. Allied logistics officers are speaking casually of pier throughput and dockyard schedules. Dockyard? His staff officer stammers an explanation. Rumors of artificial harbors, enormous structures assembled offshore. Krauss slams his fist against the table. "Impossible," he growls. "No such harbor exists. It's propaganda. They've captured a port somewhere, Cherbourg perhaps. But the truth is undeniable. Aerial reconnaissance soon confirms it. Vast lines of caissons stretching like scars across the water, ships moored alongside floating piers, trucks rolling ashore in endless columns. When the photographs reach Berlin, disbelief turns to alarm. General Alfred Jodl, reviewing the images, reportedly mutters, "My God, they are rebuilding England on our coast." For the men working the harbor, there is no time for triumph. Storm clouds are forming again to the west. The channel, ever treacherous, is about to remind the Allies that even miracles must answer to nature. Still, for the moment, it holds. The Mulberry stands, a fortress of ingenuity, anchored in surf and blood. Through it, the lifeblood of the invasion begins to flow. Fuel, rations, ammunition, reinforcements. Each convoy strengthens the Allied hold inland, pushing toward Caen, Corentin, and St. Lo. Above it all, the gulls circle and cry, their wings catching the light like flashes of silver. Below them, men in khaki and blue work side by side. Engineers, sailors, soldiers, too busy to marvel, too tired to stop. They have turned the sea into a city. And for the first time since the landings began, the Allied advance has a heartbeat strong enough to endure. June 19, 1944. The morning begins with a stiff wind off the channel. By noon it is howling. On the decks of the Mulberry Harbor at Arromanches, men grip cables and railings as waves slam against the floating piers. Rain whips sideways and the sky churns like boiling iron. From horizon to horizon, the gray expanse of water turns violent. Storm warning, an officer shouts, his voice drowned by the rising roar. Tugboats scramble for open water. Engineers rush to reinforce anchor lines with chains, their boots slipping on the slick decks. The floating causeways, those delicate steel whales that carry supplies from ship to shore, begin to twist and buckle. By dusk, the wind reaches hurricane force. The sea has turned savage. At 10 p.m., the first Phoenix caisson breaks free from its moorings. The 6,000-ton concrete block crashes sideways, striking another section of the breakwater. Men dive into the freezing surf as the massive structure collapses, waves swallowing entire sections of the artificial port. Through the night, officers send frantic radio messages to headquarters in Portsmouth. Mulberry, breaking apart. Multiple pontoons adrift. Request urgent assistance. But no help can come. The storm rages for 3 straight days, the worst channel weather in 40 years. Ships capsize, landing craft are torn from their anchors, and smaller vessels are dashed against the remains of the breakwater like toys. When the sun finally pierces the clouds on June 22, the sight is heartbreaking. Mulberry A, the American harbor off Omaha Beach, is a ruin. Concrete caissons lie shattered along the shore. The floating piers are twisted wreckage, half buried in sand. Engineers walk among the debris in silence, boots crunching over twisted steel. One American officer, Colonel William Roberts, stares out at the wreckage and mutters, "We built a harbor out of dreams, and the sea reminded us who's in charge." Across the coast at Arromanches, however, the British Mulberry B, has survived. Damaged, yes, but still standing. Its placement in a slightly more sheltered bay, combined with the furious effort of its maintenance crews, has kept it alive. Within hours, repairs begin. Divers work in the icy surf to resecure chains. Welders rejoin severed beams. Supply ships line up offshore, waiting for the signal to resume unloading. Within 48 hours, the British harbor is operational again, battered but breathing. Arromanches is holding, reads the dispatch to Allied headquarters. We will not let it fail. The resilience of Mulberry B saves the invasion. With Omaha's harbor gone, every American convoy begins diverting to the British port. For weeks, the entire logistical lifeline of the Allied advance depends on this one makeshift harbor built from ingenuity, courage, and stubbornness. Every crate unloaded, every tank driven ashore, and every ration delivered to the front lines passes across those floating piers. By July, over 1 million tons of supplies have crossed the channel through Arromanches. From the cliffs above the beach, war correspondents watch in awe. Rows of ships stretch to the horizon, offloading men and material with mechanical precision. Bulldozers, half-tracks, and jeeps rumble down the floating causeways, their engines echoing through the mist. The sea, once an enemy, has become an ally. At night, under blackout lamps, the harbor hums like a living thing. The smell of oil and salt fills the air. Engineers sleep in canvas tents on the beach, their ears tuned to the rhythm of waves slapping against steel. They know the harbor's survival is the difference between victory and disaster. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the news reaches the German High Command. Reports describe the destruction of Mulberry A, but also the impossible recovery of Mulberry B. Generals argue furiously in Hitler's war room. Some refuse to believe the Allies have managed to rebuild so quickly. Others recognize the terrifying truth: the enemy's logistical capability is now beyond anything Germany can match. In the aftermath, German intelligence documents note with grim respect: the enemy's ability to construct and sustain artificial ports under combat conditions represents a feat of engineering unprecedented in warfare. For the men who built it, no medals await. Their victories are measured in tonnage and tides, in the quiet endurance of structures battered by the sea. As July fades into August, the beaches of Normandy transform from chaotic battlegrounds into organized supply depots. Rows of trucks line the sands, carrying ammunition inland to support the breakout at St. Lo and beyond. Mulberry continues to stand, a monument to Allied engineering and sheer willpower, a harbor built from scratch that became the heartbeat of liberation. But even as it thrives, the men who designed it know its time is limited. As France opens up and the Allies capture real ports, Mulberry's mission will end. Yet its legend, the moment the sea itself was turned into a bridge to freedom, will endure long after the last caisson sinks beneath the waves. July 25, 1944. Arromanches, Normandy. The sun rises over a coastline transformed. Where, just weeks ago, the sand was soaked in blood and chaos, now cranes swing rhythmically over cargo decks. The air hums with the steady grind of engines, the bark of orders, and the rhythmic clank of steel on steel. Mulberry B, the sole surviving artificial harbor, is alive with purpose. The channel gleams beneath a convoy of Liberty ships and landing craft lined up in precise intervals. Each ship carries the lifeblood of the Allied advance: ammunition, fuel, rations, and medical supplies. At 0600 hours, a tug eases a Liberty ship toward the floating pierhead. The vast pontoon sways gently with the tide, chains creaking as they take the strain. On the shore, Captain Edward Ted Marshall of the Royal Engineers stands with a clipboard in one hand, shouting over the wind: "Keep that line taut. You've got 3 hours to unload before the next tide." Forklifts roar to life. Crates marked U.S. Army rations Type C roll down the steel causeways. Beside them, rows of Sherman tanks rumble ashore, their tracks clattering against the metal decking. The pier flexes slightly under their weight but holds firm, proof of the extraordinary precision behind its design. Every link in the chain matters. The whales, the floating roadway sections, rise and fall with the sea, allowing a seamless connection between ships and shore. The beetles, pontoon floats supporting the roadways, shift with the tide. The phoenixes stand like guardians, breaking the surf so that the inner harbor remains calm. It is an orchestra of engineering, each component performing in harmony. From above, reconnaissance planes capture the miracle in motion, a sprawling complex of piers, ships, and cranes stretching half a mile into the channel. It is not a port built over years, but assembled piece by piece in mere days, under fire, in secrecy, and in defiance of all odds. The statistics are staggering. By early August, Mulberry handles nearly 7,000 tons of supplies every day, more than many established ports. On its busiest day, over 18,000 tons flow across its floating piers: tanks, trucks, fuel drums, artillery shells, and rations for hundreds of thousands of men. Every bullet fired, every tank that moves inland toward Cannes or Falaise, owes its existence to this floating harbor. In the officers' mess that evening, Marshall sits beside a weathered sergeant from the Pioneer Corps. The older man takes a long drag from his cigarette and exhales toward the canvas ceiling. "Never thought I'd see it," he says quietly. "A bloody port built on the sea. And it works." Marshall smiles faintly. "And the Jerrys still think we're unloading in Dover." Across the channel in occupied France, German patrols peer through binoculars at the horizon, bewildered. Their intelligence reports had dismissed early rumors of floating harbors as impossible fantasy. Now, as Allied divisions pour inland with relentless momentum, those same generals realize the truth: the Mulberries have rendered natural ports irrelevant. Intercepted German radio traffic captures the disbelief. How are they landing tanks without Calais or Cherbourg? "They bring their ports with them," replies another voice grimly. For frontline soldiers, the results are tangible. Convoys no longer stall for lack of fuel or ammunition. Field hospitals receive steady deliveries of plasma and medicine. The Red Ball Express, the Allied truck network, roars to life, carrying supplies inland at all hours. Each route begins here, at the harbor that should not have been possible. As August deepens, the Allies push beyond Normandy. The harbors at Cherbourg and Le Havre, once captured, gradually take over the heavy logistical load. Yet Mulberry continues to operate tirelessly, sustaining the flow of men and material until the permanent ports are fully operational. The harbor's crews grow fiercely proud. They have survived storms, air raids, and endless fatigue. Each night, under the dim glow of blackout lamps, they maintain the floating causeways, replace damaged pontoons, and grease the great chains that moor the Phoenix caissons. The sea never sleeps, and neither can they. When visiting generals pass through, they pause in quiet awe. "What you've built here," one remarks, "isn't just a harbor. It's the backbone of the invasion." The men nod, but few speak. They know history rarely remembers the builders. Yet without them, the soldiers fighting at Caen, St. Lo, and beyond would have nothing. No ammunition, no fuel, no reinforcements. The Mulberry Harbor, a creation of pure necessity and brilliance, is as vital as any tank or gun on the battlefield. In London, Churchill receives the latest tonnage reports and writes in his journal that night, "The ingenuity of our engineers has turned the sea into a highway. The Mulberry Harbors have made the impossible possible." By the end of August 1944, as Allied forces break through Normandy and surge toward Paris, Mulberry Bay has fulfilled its destiny. It has proven that imagination, planning, and unyielding labor can overcome even the might of nature itself. Still, for those who serve upon its decks, the work continues. The tide never rests. The chains creak, the waves crash, and the endless rhythm of war carries on, fed, sustained, and made possible by the harbor the Germans never believed could exist. August 3, 1944. Headquarters of the German 7th Army, near Falaise. A group of German officers huddles around a reconnaissance photograph pinned to a wooden table. The image, grainy and smudged, shows the coast of Normandy, lined with what appear to be rows of dark rectangular blocks and spiderwebs of lines reaching into the sea. General Hans von Kluge leans forward, squinting through his spectacles. "What are we looking at here?" he demands. An intelligence officer clears his throat, pointing to the image. "High Command believed these to be debris or sunken ships. But these structures, they move with the tide. Our aerial reconnaissance confirms, they are harbors, Herr General. Floating harbors." Von Kluge blinks, incredulous. "Floating harbors? Don't be absurd. The Allies cannot build ports out of thin air." But the officer's hand trembles slightly as he slides over another image, this one sharper, captured by a Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane flying low through anti-aircraft fire. It shows what is unmistakably a massive pier stretching from the beach into the channel, with ships moored at its ends, cranes unloading vehicles and causeways linking them to the shore. A stunned silence falls over the room. The only sound is the soft hum of a generator outside. "They've built a port," murmurs Major Dietrich, an engineer. "They brought their own damn ports across the channel." Von Kluge's face hardens. He leans heavily on the table, staring at the photograph as if willing it to be a lie. "Impossible," he mutters. "No one has ever done this." But it is true. Across occupied France, German field commanders begin to grasp the magnitude of what the Allies have achieved. Reports pour in, endless supply columns rolling inland, Allied divisions advancing with no sign of logistical exhaustion. Every prediction of the German General Staff, that the invasion would collapse from lack of supplies within weeks, has been proven disastrously wrong. By August, Luftwaffe reconnaissance missions confirm what few in Berlin can comprehend. One harbor has been destroyed by storms, but the other still operates with mechanical precision. The Kriegsmarine's Naval Intelligence Bureau sends a terse report to OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Enemy has established fully functional artificial port at Aramanches. Harbor handles continuous traffic. Supplies and armor offloaded day and night. Suggest urgent countermeasures. But there are no countermeasures left to take. The Luftwaffe is a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages and Allied air supremacy prevent any large-scale bombing runs. U-boats lurk off the French coast but are hunted mercilessly by Allied aircraft and destroyers. The Mulberry Harbor, colossal, exposed, yet invulnerable, stands as a monument to Allied innovation and German disbelief. Meanwhile, on the beaches of Normandy, the Allies are advancing faster than anyone anticipated. American convoys thunder through the hedgerows, fueled by supplies unloaded from the very harbor the Germans deemed impossible. British and Canadian forces tighten the noose around Falaise. Every bullet fired, every ration delivered, every tank refueled is a victory for the floating port that defied logic. In Berlin, the news spreads quietly among the senior staff. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, studies a technical report with cold fascination. "They have done something extraordinary," he admits to a colleague. "They have turned engineering into strategy." Across Germany, soldiers and civilians alike begin to feel the repercussions. As Allied forces push inland with seemingly limitless resources, the myth of German invincibility fractures. The same officers who once mocked British improvisation now watch as Allied logistics rewrite the very laws of war. Even Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, recovering from his near-fatal air attack, receives reports from his subordinates. One of his staff officers recalls Rommel's reaction. He said simply, "Then we have already lost the war. If they can build a harbor, they can bring anything." By early September, German troops retreat eastward, harried by relentless bombardment. The Mulberry Harbor continues to pulse with activity, a mechanical heart feeding the Allied advance. On its decks, men work tirelessly, unaware that their labor has become legend. Back in Arromanches, a lone photographer from the British Army Film and Photographic Unit sets up his camera on a cliff overlooking the harbor. He captures a panoramic shot, dozens of ships, cranes swinging, waves breaking against the caissons. The image will become one of the most iconic of the entire war, proof of what human determination, imagination and courage can achieve under fire. As that photograph is developed in a darkroom hours later, a British officer remarks softly, "This is how we'll win, not with fury but with ingenuity." The Mulberry Harbor, born from desperate need and dismissed as fantasy, had changed the very nature of invasion warfare. For the first time in history, an army could bring its ports with it. And the Germans, for all their might and discipline, could do nothing but stare in disbelief. September 15, 1944. Arromanches-les-Bains, Normandy. The wind sweeps in from the channel, carrying the scent of salt, oil, and victory. The Mulberry Harbor still stands, battered, weathered, and strained by months of relentless use, yet it remains alive. The rhythmic thrum of cranes lifting crates and vehicles never stops. Allied engineers move through the maze of floating pontoons and platforms, adjusting cables, repairing joints, tightening bolts. Each clang of metal against metal echoes like a heartbeat of the invasion itself. British Lieutenant Commander John Hughes, a Royal Navy engineer, stands on a concrete caisson, gazing toward the open sea. He watches as another Liberty ship eases into position under tug control, guided by small landing craft bobbing like shepherd dogs around a giant herd. The ship's hatches open, revealing a mountain of supplies, ammunition, medical equipment, petrol, food, and trucks, all destined for the front. Hughes turns to his second officer. "Do you realize," he says, shouting over the roar of the winches, "that this harbor has landed more than 2 million men's worth of supplies since June?" The younger officer shakes his head, astonished. "And to think," Hughes adds with a grin, "some people thought it couldn't be done." A few hundred miles inland, the supplies arriving from Arromanches and Omaha sustain Operation Market Garden and the rapid Allied push toward the Rhine. Every tank that rolls, every bomber that takes off from a newly captured French airfield, every battalion that eats a hot meal before an assault, all of it owes its existence to the steady flow through the floating harbors. The Mulberry concept, once dismissed as impractical by skeptics in Whitehall and laughed at by German engineers, has become one of the decisive achievements of the war. It is not glamorous like the Spitfire or terrifying like the Tiger tank. It does not roar, fire, or charge. But it wins wars quietly, through tonnage, logistics, and persistence. As the Allied advance continues eastward, German intelligence officers scramble to comprehend the full scale of what has happened. Captured documents, post-war interrogations, and surviving Wehrmacht officers will later reveal a shared astonishment. Many believed that the invasion would collapse without a major French port. They had expected the Allies to seize Cherbourg or Le Havre first, both heavily fortified and easily defended. Instead, the Allies had outflanked German strategy entirely. When the war ends, captured German generals will admit their disbelief. One senior officer will later tell Allied interrogators, "We could never have imagined that the British and Americans would build a harbor and make it work. We prepared for an army. We were not prepared for engineers." In London, meanwhile, the planners who had once fought to make the Mulberry concept a reality reflect on what it accomplished. Winston Churchill himself, reviewing after-action reports, writes a private note acknowledging the project's brilliance. "The harbors of Normandy represent the triumph of British engineering and American vigor. Without them, our enterprise might have failed." He orders that all surviving documentation on the Mulberry be preserved for future generations. As 1944 turns to 1945, the remnants of the Mulberry Harbor continue to operate, weathering brutal storms and endless traffic. By the time the Allies capture Antwerp and reopen continental ports, the Mulberry's mission is complete. The floating giants are dismantled piece by piece, their steel and concrete towed away or left to sink beneath the waves. Yet not all vanish. Today, fragments of those harbors still lie scattered along the French coast, giant blocks of concrete half buried in sand, seaweed clinging to their sides. At low tide, they stand silent and immovable, reminders of a time when faith in the impossible changed the course of history. Tourists walking along the beaches of Arromanches often pause before these relics. They run their hands over the cold, barnacled surfaces, trying to imagine the thunder of trucks, the hum of cranes, the echo of boots striking metal. Many don't realize that beneath their feet lies the very foundation of victory in Western Europe. Every Allied advance, from Normandy to Paris, from the Seine to the Rhine, was fueled by what those harbors delivered. The Mulberry Project wasn't just an engineering triumph. It was a symbol of Allied cooperation, ingenuity, and willpower. When the German generals called it impossible, they revealed their greatest weakness, not a lack of courage but a lack of imagination. Because in modern warfare, imagination wins wars just as surely as bullets. And in 1944, on a battered French shoreline, imagination floated and conquered. June 6, 1945. 1 year after D-Day. The beaches of Normandy are quiet again. The roar of invasion has faded, replaced by the sound of waves gently lapping against rusted steel and weathered concrete. A few British engineers walk along the shoreline near Arromanches, gazing out at what remains of their creation, the last surviving Mulberry Harbor. Captain Alan Richards, Royal Engineers, kneels beside a broken section of a whale roadway, one of the floating bridges that had once connected the beach to the floating pierheads. He runs his gloved hand over the corroded metal, shaking his head in disbelief. "It's strange," he murmurs to a companion. "We built it to last for weeks, maybe a month. And it's still here." The younger officer, Lieutenant Browning, smiles faintly. "Funny, sir. The Germans thought we were mad. And yet this madness won the war." Richards chuckles softly, the sound carried away by the wind. "Madness," he says, "and genius." The tide recedes, revealing vast concrete caissons, the Phoenix units, still half buried in sand. Each one weighs thousands of tons. They once formed the breakwaters that sheltered ships during the stormy summer of 1944. Now they sit like ancient monuments, silent witnesses to one of the most audacious engineering feats ever attempted in wartime. As reconstruction begins across Europe, the story of the Mulberry Harbors spreads far beyond military circles. Engineers, planners, and scientists study their design, fascinated by their success. Reports are published, blueprints are analyzed, and lectures are held at universities from London to Washington. The lessons learned from Mulberry will shape post-war engineering for decades. Floating bridges, modular pontoons, and prefabricated construction techniques all find new civilian uses in rebuilding Europe. The concept of mobile, temporary infrastructure becomes a cornerstone of modern military and civil logistics. But for many of the men who built and operated the harbors, their legacy is more personal. They remember the long nights under fire, welding steel by searchlight as artillery thundered inland. They remember the smell of salt and oil, the taste of ration tea, the sound of anchors grinding against the seabed. For them, the Mulberry was not just a structure, it was a lifeline, a defiance of despair. Meanwhile, in Germany, captured officers reflect on what the Allies accomplished. During post-war interrogations at the Nuremberg trials and Allied intelligence debriefings, they admit that the Mulberry Harbors had changed their perception of the war. General Alfred Jodl, former chief of operations for the German High Command, remarked during questioning, "We underestimated the enemy's ability to think beyond conventional limits. The Allies built where we believed nature forbade construction. It was unthinkable." German engineers who examined post-war documents on Mulberry were equally astonished. Some privately confessed admiration for the Allied imagination and speed. One Luftwaffe engineer reportedly said, "They made the impossible look routine. That was the true power of the Allies, not their numbers but their will to innovate." The Mulberry Harbors symbolized that spirit of innovation. They represented the moment when creativity triumphed over conventional warfare, when steel and imagination combined to overcome geography itself. In a war remembered for destruction, the Mulberries were a rare example of construction, an act of creation amidst chaos. By 1945, as Allied ships dock in newly captured ports like Antwerp and Le Havre, the Mulberry Harbors are finally retired. Some sections are dismantled and towed back to England. Others are left to the tides. Fishermen begin to navigate around the giant ruins, unaware that they are sailing through history. In the decades that follow, the remnants of the harbors become part of the landscape. Children play on their remains. Seabirds nest among the rusted joints. Divers explore their submerged skeletons. The concrete giants endure storms and seasons, standing as ghostly sentinels of ingenuity. In 1970, the French government officially declares the remains of the Arromanches Mulberry Harbor a historic monument. It becomes a place of remembrance, not only for the soldiers who fought and died on those beaches, but for the engineers, sailors, and workers who built the impossible. Tourists visiting the site today often stand on the cliffs above Arromanches, gazing out at the ghostly shapes in the surf. The sun catches the broken edges of the old harbor, and for a moment, the imagination can almost bring it back. The endless line of ships, the thundering cranes, the hum of engines, the shouting of men hauling supplies for freedom. If you close your eyes, you can still hear it, the sound of victory forged not in fire but in steel and vision. Because while tanks and aircraft may have won battles, it was engineering like the Mulberry Harbors that won the war.